topics. The national banking system. This is a Civil War measure. So once again, a war breaks out, and the Union doesn't have a central bank, and it needs credit and inflation to finance, in this case, a much more expensive war. So the Treasury Secretary, Samuel Chase, and Ohio Senator John Sherman, and by the way, if you guys don't know about John Sherman, he probably isn't the worst senator in the history of the U.S., but he's got to be one of the worst. This is the same Sherman behind the Sherman Act, the Antitrust Act that went after Standard Oil, and also the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act, which is that bimetallism thing I told you guys about that caused the Panic of 1893. This guy Sherman caused so much trouble with his interventions for the U.S. economy. They drafted up this system of nationally chartered banks, or national banks. And the idea is that these national banks, they would issue uniform banknotes to make the banknotes consistent, and they would follow reserve requirements that Washington, D.C. would dictate. Gold and silver were all considered legal reserves, but a new reserve was added called the greenback. Maybe some of you have heard of it. So the federal government started issuing fiat paper money, maybe for the first time, irredeemable fiat money, and the national banks were told this legally is as good as gold or silver. You can pyramid credit and your own banknotes on top of greenbacks. Although I will give them credit, the greenbacks eventually, when the war was over, it took a while, but eventually the greenbacks were all converted to holders into gold or silver. So it was fiat at first, but when the war ended, the federal government actually stood by a redemption pledge and converted them all, and they eventually left circulation. The system itself was kind of complex. Banks were tiered into three levels. You had central reserve city banks, which were basically New York Wall Street banks. And then the next layer were called reserve city banks. These are major banks in large cities like Chicago and St. Louis and Philadelphia. And then you had country banks, which were these little tiny unit banks scattered all over the countryside. And there was this complex relationship devised between the three. I'm going to skip the pros for now. I'll just illustrate it with a diagram instead. So before the national banking system, if you were any bank, not just a reserve city bank, you had a base of gold or silver reserves in your vaults. And then atop that, you wrote banknotes or you issued deposit balances to borrowers that were some amount greater than your reserves. That's what we call fractional reserve banking. And the idea is the bank is betting on not everyone coming back at the same time to redeem those notes and deposits. So you have this inverted pyramid, and every bank was responsible for its own reserves and its own liabilities, that they all stood or fell on their own. Now, under the national banking system, and by the way, any of you who've read Rothbard about this, he has his own diagram for this, which I've never been satisfied, so I spent way too much time building this one, okay? So down here, you still have a Wall Street bank, a Central Reserve City Bank, and it has gold and silver, and it issues deposits and notes. But under the national banking system, a reserve city bank in St. Louis or Philadelphia was allowed to write banknotes or issue deposits not only on gold or silver, but also with deposits with an account that it had with a Wall Street bank. So the Wall Street bank prints paper money, and the paper money is used as a reserve to print more paper money by a reserve city bank. And a country bank, by the way, could dip into either the Wall Street bank's deposits or a reserve city's deposits, and it can create more paper and deposits on top of that. So what you have here is a much larger quantity of deposits and banknotes circulating throughout the economy than you otherwise could have achieved with the same amount of gold or silver, i.e. inflation, right? More credit, more money based on the same amount of gold or silver, and of course we have greenbacks. Again, this is to finance the Civil War. I don't know if any of you have read this, but prices roughly doubled in the 3.5-4 years of the Civil War, so that's an inflation rate of about 20% in the Union. Of course, it was hyperinflation in the Confederacy, right? The Confederacy printed so much money, even the counterfeiters didn't bother. It was a money loser to counterfeit the Confederacy. It's true. The Confederate graybacks were a money loser to counterfeit, right? Okay, so the result is we have a lot of inflation, and 1 ounce in gold in New York is creating demand deposit balances equal to a multiple of reserves, and reserve and country banks are creating balances that are also a multiple of that same ounce of gold in New York. Now, the state banks themselves, they weren't really crazy about this system. They didn't see much in it for them. Although if you were a national bank, you did have a line of credit with your New York City, your connected New York City Wall Street bank. But a lot of state banks said, hey, why should I even bother? So seeing as it wasn't going very well, in 1865, Congress passed a 10% tax. They basically took the gloves off. They said, okay, if you don't want to, if we can't beat them, we'll make them join us. And a 10% federal tax was passed on every state banknote that was issued. Now, I don't know if you guys can appreciate how huge a tax this is. In this day and age, banks don't issue notes. You don't have gold or silver, but there is a pretty close analogy. Today we have a checkbook balance, right? And then you go to the bank and you pull cash out of the ATM or you get cash from the teller. If you can imagine, every time you pull money out of an ATM or cash from a teller, if that bank had to pay 10% of the value of that cash to the federal government in taxes, how long would that bank last? Okay, the intended effect is not long. Okay, so the state banks either A, went out of business, or B, they went out of the banknote business, I should say. So they remain banks of deposit, but they simply quit printing banknotes. Or more commonly, in order to survive, they had to join the national system, so they became national banks themselves. But in the end, what happens is, and this is very important, the member banks of the national system now have the monopoly on issuing notes. So the only way cash can exist in the United States is if it's issued by a national bank. Now, it's still competitive. There's still a lot of banks, even though they're unit banks. It's not like there's just one bank like the Fed doing it. But the key here, because it's going to come up in a couple of slides, is that only the national banks could issue cash or currency. Eventually, the state banks were allowed to issue cash, but they had to issue national banknotes. So that really isn't the same as state banknotes. They basically opened a deposit account in a national bank, and then they would buy the national banknotes, and they would dole them out to their customers. Okay, and all this time, the national banks, they may be chartered by the federal government, and this is also a key point, but they were still subject to the state level unit banking restrictions. So we still have these tiny little standalone banks all over the country. It's just that they're now issuing national currency. And here's an example, by the way, of national currency. The National Bank of Sacramento. Okay. Being Sacramento, I'm not sure how much I would trust it. Okay, but if you look at the national banknotes of that era, they all kind of look the same, but they just had a different bank name on them. Okay, here is the final restriction or final major restriction. This is kind of the climax of the instability that resulted from these regulations. If you're a national bank and you want to issue a banknote, the federal government requires you to back those notes 111%, so $1.11 to the dollar with U.S. Treasury bonds. Now, why would they do that? Anyone want to take a stab at that? Okay, it's Civil War era legislation. The government needs a loan. So what better way to do it than to say, okay, you're a national bank. If you want to issue banknotes, you got to lend us money. You got to hold our bonds. It was a wartime revenue measure. And I'm not saying I agree with the Civil War or any war in particular, but if the government wants to issue revenue, wants to obtain revenue, wants a loan from the banks, this is probably a fairly effective way to do it. But the amount of cash circulating in the economy is now dependent mathematically on the amount of debt. Sound familiar? Okay, that the federal government. Right? Okay, so this is for nerds like me. This is a wonderful chart. Okay, this is the result. So I've got a great chart I found here from Cato. One chart represents the money supply of the United States, and one chart represents the money supply of Canada. And I want to be very clear. Did I just say money supply? Yeah. I shouldn't have said that. I'm sorry. Okay, let me correct that. And I want to be very clear about the correction. These lines are the currency supply, the amount of cash, not the entire money supply. So if you added deposit balances, the money supplies would be some higher number. So this is strictly banknotes in circulation, currency, cash, and what have you. Now, I know you have a 50-50 chance. I don't expect anyone to know, but someone want to impress me here. Did anyone want to guess which line is the United States and which line is Canada? Okay, I didn't know. I couldn't have guessed myself until I read the whole thing. Okay. All right. The flat, relatively flat, smooth line is the U.S., and the jagged sawtooth line is Canada. Okay, so in the United States we have this smooth amount of currency in circulation. In Canada it's moving up and down a lot. Okay, all right, why is that? So here we go. See, U.S. national banknotes and Canadian banknotes. So let's start with the U.S. First of all, we got a problem here. The amount of currency, the currency supply is shrinking dramatically at a time of rapid economic growth. I mean, that's a problem. Right? You would think in the 1880s and in the 1890s, minus the depression of 1893, this is the 1880s. By the way, is one of the fastest rates, decades of growth in American history, and yet the currency supply is falling. Okay? Now, why is that? Gold standard. You know, that's a really good guess. You sound like a Keynesian, by the way, but but actually, there was new gold being mined. The gold supply was actually increasing. But no, it's that banknote requirement. So when the war is over, I know this will shock people in the room, what do you think the government did with the debt? It slowly paid it off. Yeah, exactly. I know that's unheard of in this day and age, right? Okay, federal government runs consistent surpluses. By the way, it was under successive Republican administrations, which is probably a shock too in this day and age as well. Okay, since no party pays off the debt anymore. But the number of bonds, the quantity of bonds outstanding was shrinking as the government ran surpluses and paid off the debt. So these bonds are becoming more and more scarce, and yet the banks, the national banks, aren't allowed to issue currency in banknotes unless they have enough bonds to back it up. So the result is the banks simply can't issue the currency. Furthermore, what makes this even worse, much worse, is what happens with seasonal demands for currency, namely, since the U.S. was still highly agricultural back then, during harvest. Okay, during harvest season, farmers go to the bank and they say, I've got a demand deposit balance, but I got a lot of hired hands I got to pay. I need cash. And what did the bank say? The bank said, I'm sorry, sir, I can't give you cash. Okay, due to these U.S. bondholding, I'm not sure they explained it to the farmer, but due to these bondholding requirements, we can't issue you notes. And the farmer say, well, I got to pay my hired hands with something because people didn't have checking accounts back then. So the farmer says, give me gold coin. When the bank is forced to issue coin to their customer, their claimant, what happens to the credit and money supply? It contracts. Okay, the bank, that's a reserve. Okay, back in those days, a deposit and cash were interchangeable. Well, neither was a reserve. The reserve was gold. Today, cash is a reserve. If you go to the bank and say, I want to pull out cash, the bank eventually is going to have to contract their credit. But back then, if you said, I want to convert my deposit to a cash, there was no change in the money supply, no change in credit. Okay, they were both claims on the same reserve, which is gold. So harvest season tended to create panics, and it's no coincidence. If you look at the dates on these late 19th century panics, the overwhelming majority of them occur in September or October and in the fall months. Okay. Now, by contrast, let's look at the Canadian line. See that jagged sawtooth, up and down, up and down, up and down? Okay. That up corresponds to harvest season. The down is when the harvest season is over. So here you have a system of competitive nationally branched banks responding to the seasonal demands of their customers, responding to market forces, right? If a Keynesian didn't know any better, they'd look at this line and say, oh, what omniscient, enlightened central banker is doing this? The answer is none. There was no central bank in Canada until 1935. This is the market working, okay? This is competition doing this. As you can see, eventually the U.S. government recognized the problem and issued some more bonds. And finally, by the late first decade of the 20th century, the amount of bonds in circulation is sufficient. I actually did the math on this. By the time you get here, in nominal terms, the U.S. GDP is double what it was back here. So all this time it's catching up. There's still an insufficient amount of banknotes available all the way up until this point, where you finally have an amount of cash that's consonant with the growth in the overall economy. Okay, this bond holding requirement was probably the biggest cause of the instability during the last 50 years before the creation of the Federal Reserve. Compounded by, right, all that inflation. Now the farmers want their ounce of gold, and the country bank saying, I don't have it, let me go to my Reserve City Bank. The Reserve City Bank saying, I don't have it, let me go to my New York Wall Street Bank. Now you have the whole country chasing the same ounce of gold in a New York Wall Street Bank, and it doesn't have enough gold to back it up either. Okay, I'm going to skip the summary here, and also for the sake of time. And I want to say a word or two about Canada. So this is our stark contrast. During the national banking system period, the U.S. has multiple crises, 1873, 80, I think, 84, 90, 93, 96, 1900, 1907. So at least 8 that I can think of. Canada has 0. Okay? They have national branch banking. There's no bondholding restriction. Canada, by the way, has never had a financial crisis in its entire history. Okay, versus 20 or 21 in the U.S., which is really remarkable if you consider we share a 2,000-mile border, we share a language, we share a common culture, we share, what else do we share? The same football, right, I guess. Comedians, yeah, acting. But our origins are very similar, right? We adopted English or Scottish common law, but the one difference is we adopted different banking systems. Okay, the American banking system was adopted from England, predominantly. Hamilton was a huge admirer of the British system. Who predominantly settled Canada other than the French? Scots. Okay, it's true. You know, Nova Scotia, okay, and the Bank of Nova Scotia. By the way, the Bank of Nova Scotia, which is Scotiabank today, it's the second oldest bank in Canada, and it's the oldest bank operating that was founded in an English-speaking region. The oldest bank in Canada is the Bank of Montreal, of course, which is founded in Quebec. But the Scots, by now, they've had, over a century of free banking in Scotland. When they came over, it wasn't like they brought a whole troop of economists with them. They just brought the system that they were familiar with to Canada. So it's not a coincidence that the two systems were so similar. Canada had no central bank at all, not even like a Bank of the United States version central bank until 1935. And 1935, by the way, is beyond the trough of the Great Depression. So if anyone tries to argue, well, Canada handled the Great Depression better because they had a central bank. No, the darkest days of the Great Depression were 1932 and 33. Okay, by 35, the entire world was in recovery. During the Great Depression, almost 10,000 banks failed in the United States, overwhelmingly unit banks. In Canada, there were 0. Through the entire Great Depression, not a single bank failed. And why? I think we've already talked about why, right? In the USA, we have restrictions on bank branching, we have bondholding requirements, we have this pyramid structure from the national banking system, whereas in Canada, none of these restrictions existed. And by the way, in case you didn't believe me, I found this news article from 1985. 2 banks actually failed in Alberta in 1985, and the story starts with Canada has had its first bank failure since 1923. So that's 62 years which includes the Great Depression, where not a single bank has failed in Canada. One more note about Canada, by the way. It's called a quote-unquote free banking system until the Bank of Canada was formed. And by the way, the Bank of Canada was quickly nationalized, I think in 1937, and by World War II, it's now the monopoly issuer of currency. So the Canadian system quickly goes from a very lightly regulated to a central bank monopoly system just in a period of 10 years. But I don't want to give anyone any illusions that it's a completely laissez-faire system. Okay, it was close. It's about as close as any country has ever gotten in the modern age, but it was not laissez-faire. And an example would include in 1871, the Canadian government began getting into the banknote business itself, unfortunately. It started issuing small denomination notes called Dominion notes, although the government was required to hold a 20% gold reserve, so it could not go go wild and print as much money as it wanted. And in 1907, that was a record year for bank failures in Canada. 3 banks, compared to 10,000 in the U.S., right? 3 banks failed in 1907. They were all small. I believe my history, one of them was taken over by the Bank of Montreal, so the depositors didn't lose anything. And it was such a smooth process. Even in 1907, the customers never even knew what had happened. They just came to the bank on Monday, and there was a sign that said, "This is the Bank of Montreal," right? I think the second one also ultimately paid all of its depositors back in full, and maybe one of the 3 failed, and depositors only got a certain number of pennies or whatever on the dollar. But ironically, even those failures were the result of government intervention, because by this point, the Canadian government has issued its own restriction stating that Canadian banks can only issue private bank notes if they're backed by 100% of paid-in capital and their capital accounts in equity. Now, this is better than our system because unlike U.S. bonds, your paid-in capital and your equity are not diminishing nationwide the way U.S. bonds were. But it was still a restriction on them that prevented them from issuing as many notes as the market demanded. So right after 1907, the Canadian government simply raised the limit from 100% to 115%. It's okay, that'll fix it, which it did. By contrast, in the United States, what do? Do we remove all these restrictions and fix the core problem? No, the U.S. just created the Federal Reserve and put it on top of an already lousy system to act as a lender of last resort. Okay. One more quick note, this is actually not quite as quick, about Scotland. What ended up happening in Scotland? Well, in this 30-year period from 1791 to 1821, the British system, which was highly restricted, suffered 300 bank failures, whereas during the same period, actually going 10 years further back, 40 years in Scotland, there were 0 failures. Although I do say 0 joint stock failures, that refers to a bank with lots of partners paying in capital. The reason I differentiate is because joint stock banks were illegal in England during this time, all right? You could only have 6 partners. The only joint stock bank was the central bank, the Bank of England. So there's one contrast, 300 failures versus 0. Then the Panic of 1825, this was a post-Napoleonic War panic where England goes back on the gold standard and accepts the necessary contraction in the money supply. About 80 banks fail during that crisis. 700 to 800 banks, which was effectively every bank in England, had to go to the Bank of England asking for assistance. In Scotland, 4 banks were affected. That doesn't mean failure, it means affected. Okay, and of those 4, 1 was acquired by another bank seamlessly. 2 did pay their liabilities in full but closed their doors. And the only one bank that failed, where the depositors didn't get all their money back, failed 4 years later in 1829. A contemporary observer, economic observer at the time, and this is the quote at the bottom, stated that the comparative exemption of this part of the empire, i.e. Scotland, from the revulsions that have made so much havoc in England. Okay, I know that's an incomplete sentence, but he's noticing in 1826 that Scotland has been spared the worst of the crisis. There's another panic in 1837, which was the result of Bank of England policy as well. Again, you have an economic historian in 1911 who notes that, quote, in the heavy losses and banking failures which ensued, Scotland had little share. And then a contemporary in 1838 economist wrote, quote, while England during the last year has suffered in almost every branch of her national industry, Scotland has passed comparatively uninjured through the late monetary crisis. Unfortunately, free banking, quote unquote, did not live forever in Scotland. George asked me several months ago, how did they stay independent from the Bank of England? And the answer is, well, not for long. Okay, free banking effectively ended in Scotland in 1845. So in 1844, Conservative Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel approves of, I don't know how it works in England, I guess the Prime Minister signed the legislation from Parliament like our President does? I don't know. But effectively, Parliament passes a legal monopoly for the Bank of England to issue banknotes. So now there's no more private banknote issuance in England. Then a year later, they go after Scotland, but they're much more lenient. In Scotland, the existing banks are still allowed to issue banknotes, but no new entry is permitted. And that really is a big deal because you don't really have capitalism if you don't allow any new competitors to enter into the market. Scottish banks could issue banknotes, but they were held to 100% of specie reserve, so anyone here who's big on full reserve banking would probably be pleased by that. And when the debate was going on, Peel himself, you know how the Prime Minister goes to Parliament and has to field the questions from the MPs? He had to defend the act during the debate against, quote, advocates for unlimited competition, unquote. Okay, so where have we heard this before? Okay, so this is people who are anti-capitalism in the United States will say, well, that unlimited competition is so horrible, we have to do something about it. No, there was nothing wrong with unlimited competition in Scotland. Then, even worse, and this actually relates directly to this whole presentation, Peel cited the quote-unquote free banking system of the U.S. as a disastrous example of unlimited competition in practice. So Peel himself is apparently unaware of unit banking restrictions, the first bank of the United States, the second bank of the United States, and just like Paul Krugman and the Washington Post and the major newspapers and academics, he's calling the United States a laissez-faire system and pointing to all of the panics in the U.S. saying, well, this is why we need a central bank here in England. The whole party ends, and I'm getting way ahead of myself here, but for those of you who sat in on my Great Depression talk, in 1931, the Bank of England goes off gold completely, so now Scottish banks no longer have a gold backing requirement. And today, actually, they didn't even have it anyway. For those of you who remember my presentation, England went off gold in 1914, and even when they went back on gold in 25, the British citizens still couldn't get gold. So for all practical purposes, the British Empire is off the gold standard. It's just foreign central banks that are allowed to redeem for gold during this period. Interestingly enough, even today in the year 2018, 3 private banks continue to issue banknotes in Scotland. Scotland, Northern Ireland, Hong Kong, I believe, are the 3 countries left in the world where private banks issue currency and banknotes. The banks being the Bank of Scotland, the Royal Bank of Scotland, and the Clydesdale Bank. But is it really money? Is it backed by gold? No. Scottish banknotes have to be 100% backed by Bank of England banknotes. Okay, and Bank of England banknotes, as we all know, are fiat, right? I mean, I don't even know why they keep calling them pound sterling. Any resemblance to sterling disappeared, 100 years ago. Okay, so we have one chapter left. I'm going to open it up to 2 or 3 questions about the national banking system and the first 2 central banks. Anyone? Okay, George?
The central question I have, as I was before, is you make a sound case for why the Canadian and the Scottish banks had a superior banking system in those years. Why didn't those countries just outperform the United States, and why didn't Scotland outperform every industrial metric the rest of England, Great Britain?
So
because of a superior banking system.
So the question is, for the recording, if Scotland and Canada had superior banking systems to the U.S. and England, why didn't their economies outperform the English and American economies? Well, that's a huge question, especially on the U.S. side. On the Scottish side, I think I've already answered it. Right, during the free banking period from 1745, I think, to 1755 to 1845, in a span of 90 years, per capita GDP in Scotland relative to England increases by 100%. So the average Scot is only, if you want to use the term as rich, I know that's not quite what GDP means, but the average Scot or Scotsman is only half as rich as his English counterpart in 1755. 90 years later, he's equally rich to his English counterpart. So now, why didn't Scotland become this huge world superpower? I mean, that's political, and Scotland's also population-wise very small compared to England, and I'd probably punt that as a partial answer for Canada and the U.S. And Canada's
they both have colder climates, both further north.
So of course, the British have better climate than the Spanish, and they whoop them, right? So, that's a huge question, and I have some ideas when you ask the question, but I think it would take longer to go into the theories why. Maybe the one other thing I would add is maybe Canadians would argue and say the United States hasn't outperformed the Canadian economy that much. Canada is part of the G8, even today. Their per capita income is slightly lower than ours, but they're one of the, along with the other British former colonies, New Zealand, Australia, U.S., Singapore. That's one of my personal favorites, former British colony. They're all among the richest countries in the world now. Okay, so for time, I want to hit the last section because we haven't heard much talk about the Fed yet, right? You guys came here to hear about the Federal Reserve, right? You're thinking this is bait and switch. No, we're going to talk about the Fed. All right.